We have seen him as an economist, an advisor, and the member of the Niti Aayog. But Bibek Debroy is much more than an economic advisor. His knowledge of Sanskrit and the scriptures can be challenged by a few. He's here today to make sense of the Gita for the millennials. Senior journalist and author Kaveri Bamzai will be in conversation with him.
It's a wonderful book that sort of not just introduces you to the Gita, but also gives you so much information on it that even people who know it perhaps would be surprised. Vivek, thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to begin with what I found, one of the things that I found quite surprising was the number of Gitas or Geets there are. It's not just the Bhagavad Gita. So, would you like to elaborate on that, please?
The Bhagavad Gita has been translated several times in English, in other languages. People have interpreted it, analyzed it, drawn lessons from the Bhagavad Gita. Often when they do this, they look at the Bhagavad Gita as a text isolation, as a standalone text, which may be fine, but it is also important to realize that the Bhagavad Gita is embedded in the Mahabharata. It's part of the Mahabharata. So therefore there is a continuity with the Mahabharata, and the Bhagavad Gita is an integral part of the Mahabharata. My intention in this particular book was not to do a translation. I've done that in the past. It was to get the so-called millennials, even millennials like Kaveri, to get interested in reading the Bhagavad Gita. Now, to answer the question directly, Gita is anything that is sung. Gita is anything that is chanted. There is the qualifying adjective Bhagavat, which automatically suggests that there must be other Gitas also. It cannot be the case that the Bhagavad Gita is the only Gita. And indeed, across different texts, there are around almost 60 different Gitas, depending a little bit on how you define a Gita, because every text may not necessarily be referred to as a Gita, although it was sung or chanted.
Right.
Some of these other Gitas people are familiar with, like the Ashtavakra Gita, at least the name one is familiar with. There are texts like the Uddhav Gita, which is from one of the Puranas, but the Mahabharata itself has around 20 Gitas. The two that people are probably most familiar with are the Dharma Vyad Gita and the Anu Gita. But there are around 20 Gitas. There are things that are not directly referred to as Gitas, but are very much along the same line, something like Yaksha Prashna, for example.
The idea that this is the only Gita is not so, but of course, this is the one that we really have grown up with and is the most popular. It's very much in the background of our lives, and yet we do not know of it fully. And that, I think, is something that needs to be corrected, which I presume is why you wrote this.
I wrote this to get millennials to read the Bhagavad Gita. Not just read the Bhagavad Gita, read the Bhagavad Gita in the Sanskrit. Which is why there is a chapter
yes,
on Sanskrit.
Yeah.
On poetry, because all of these texts are poetry. The Bhagavad Gita is excellent, excellent poetry, not just in chapter 11.
Right.
So I wanted people to get sufficiently familiar to read the text of the Bhagavad Gita in Sanskrit. And then read translations, then read commentaries, instead of doing what often turns out to be a very superficial exercise, 5 lessons from the Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah.
I didn't want the millennials to do that. And as I said earlier, to appreciate the Bhagavad Gita, one has to understand the Mahabharata, one has to understand the role of Krishna. So I have put in all of that explanatory stuff in chapters so that people get interested.
Right. Let's talk about Krishna, because in the Mahabharata we see him as a very wise counsel, as someone who advises Arjun on the battlefield and resolves very complex issues. We also know of him as a playful god, a very accessible god. Talk a little about why Krishna is such a loved god in India.
I won't answer that question, Kaveri, because this is about the Bhagavad Gita.
Right.
It's not about the role of Krishna.
Hmm.
And I am averse to using words that are imported and implanted from the West,
Hmm.
including a word like God.
Right.
The word God has different meanings. So whenever you are using the word God or someone else is using the word God, he or she intends a certain meaning.
Hmm.
The word God etymologically
Hmm.
has roots in, is cognate with a Sanskrit root.
Hmm.
That Sanskrit root is hutam.
Hmm.
And most people do not know this. And it is a tragedy and travesty that millennials don't know that the
Hmm.
word God has a cognate root in Sanskrit known as hutam. What
Hutam.
is hutam?
Hmm.
What is hutam? Hutam is someone you offer oblations to.
Right.
So if at the time of the Rajasuya Yajna,
Hmm.
the first arghya was offered to Krishna in the Mahabharata. This book is about the Bhagavad Gita, it's not about the Mahabharata.
Hmm.
Was offered to Krishna, then in some sense Krishna was Hutam. But
Hmm.
I would not like to use the word God.
Hmm.
For the Mahabharata,
Hmm.
as with the Bhagavad Gita, my plea to the
Hmm.
younger generation
Hmm.
would be not to decide on what kind of individual Krishna was
Right.
on the basis of what one has picked up from 144 character Twitter narrations or from television serials or from abridged tellings. So let's leave Krishna and Krishna's role in the entire Mahabharata out of it.
Hmm. Hmm. And yet you've spent a lot of time discussing his historicity.
Only the historicity.
Yes.
Only the historicity, because the historicity is germane, because quite often people do not
Hmm.
realize that there was a certain date, whatever be the date, when the Kurukshetra war happened.
Right.
And there was a certain date when the Mahabharata and therefore the Bhagavad Gita was composed. And the
Hmm.
two are not identical.
Hmm.
It is only to make that point that I've spent time
Hmm.
on the historicity of Krishna,
Hmm.
not on his role in the Mahabharata. That is a bigger exercise.
Yeah, right. You've spent a lot of time on that. You've also spent a lot of time on Sanskrit, as you said. And I was just wondering, can one, deracinated as some of us are, can one teach oneself Sanskrit using some of the tips that you have given us, including on how to read the words?
I have not given tips on reading Sanskrit. I have given tips on reading the alphabet.
Alphabet.
That's it.
Yeah.
Now, can one learn Sanskrit on one's own
Yeah.
at home?
Yeah.
Of course, one can,
Yeah.
because I have no formal training in Sanskrit. My entire learning of Sanskrit has been self-taught at home.
Right.
So I would certainly argue that, of course, it's possible to do that if you're interested in doing it.
Yeah. Right.
And one of the points that's made in the book is that the Sanskrit of the Bhagavad Gita is relatively simple. It is not the Sanskrit of Kalidasa. For the average person who is familiar with Devanagari or any Indian script,
Right.
understanding the Bhagavad Gita is no big deal once you have done the two obvious things that happen in Sanskrit, namely the Sandhi. So once you've done the Padachhed and the Anvay, most people will find it reasonably easy to understand the Bhagavad Gita. It seems complicated because the Sanskrit is a language which flows freely. The last letter of any word joins with the first letter of the next word.
Right, right,
So once it is broken up, it's not that difficult to understand.
right. Let's talk a little about that whole synthesis of the mind, body, and the heart. Bhakti, Gyan, Karma. Can we talk about that? How does the Bhagavad Gita synthesize all of that?
One can talk about it, but again, one should not talk about it. The reason one should not talk about it is this is again a very superficial impression, probably amongst all millennials, that here is the Bhagavad Gita, and the Bhagavad Gita has these three parts of Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga. Here are 6 chapters on Karma Yoga, here are 6 chapters on Jnana Yoga, here are 6 chapters on Bhakti Yoga. I think the first thing to realize is the chapter headings did not exist in the original text.
Right.
The colophons at the end of the chapter did not exist in the original text. This is not just of the Bhagavad Gita, of the Mahabharata also.
Right.
The synthesis is not Gyan, Karma, and Bhakti. The synthesis is also about notions of yoga.
Yeah.
The synthesis is about notions of Sankhya. The synthesis is about notions of tapas. The synthesis is about Pancharatra, the Pancharatra doctrines. Now, these ones that I've just mentioned are normally not mentioned by people. That is why if you read the chapter that I've got on the Bhagavad Gita synthesis,
Synthesis.
it is not about karma, bhakti, and jnana, because I believe
Sankhya.
those are artificial
Yeah.
stereotype notions which do not appreciate the true nature of the synthesis.
Let's talk about, please explain to us the true nature of that synthesis between Samkhya and Tapas, right?
For that, my plea would be for people to read the book, because how much time are you going to give me? You are going to give me a little bit time.
Yeah.
Now, my submission is, and I've resisted from quoting anything in Sanskrit so far, but now I shall, which is also quoted in the book. There is a famous stotram composed by Adi Shankaracharya. It's a very familiar one. It goes by the name of Bhaja Govindam. In Bhaja Govindam, there is half a bit. Bhagavad Gita Kinchit Adhita. I have studied a little bit of the Bhagavad Gita. To me, as Adi Shankaracharya intended, this is a meaningless statement. If you are interested, find the time. If you are not interested, if you don't have the time, that's fine. But do not try to do Bhagavad Gita for dummies in 30 seconds. In exactly that fashion, if I'm to explain the Bhagavad Gita synthesis, I would have to read out that entire chapter, which I don't want to do, because this is not prime time television. Tell me what is the Bhagavad Gita synthesis in 30 seconds. If that's what you have time for, then stay away from the Bhagavad Gita. Don't do Bhagavad Gita Kinchita Gita.
What does that mean, Bhagavad Gita Kinchita Dita?
I just explained.
That is like
I've studied a
a little
little
bit.
bit, or X has studied a little bit of the Bhagavad Gita.
Okay. Sounds quite interesting. Can we talk about the ideas of dharma, arth, dharma, arth, kam, moksha?
Well, dharma, artha, kama, moksha are regarded as the four purusharthas or objectives of human existence.
Right.
The word dharma is impossible to translate it into English. It should not be translated into English without the context. There is a shloka which tries to define dharma. It says, Yah dharyate saha dharma. Whatever holds up is dharma. Now, different things hold up the fabric of society, moral fabric, other kinds of fabrics. So, dharma, in certain senses, is task, it's duty, it is what in English we would imperfectly translate as religion. Raja dharma is governance. So, we should not try to translate the word dharma really. However, when I'm saying without the context, dharma, artha, kama, moksha, moksha is emancipation, liberation. Emancipation, liberation from what? Emancipation, liberation from samsara.
Right.
What is samsara? Samsara is the cycle of worldly existence. Samsara is the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. So that liberation is moksha. And obviously the Bhagavad Gita and other parts of the Mahabharata also, they talk about moksha dharma. However, moksha dharma is not for everyone. The Bhagavad Gita itself says that only very few people will actually get moksha. For the rest, it is dharma, artha, kama. Kama is the pursuit of sensual pleasures. It is invariably interpreted as sexual pleasures, but kama is not pure sex, it is sensual pleasures. If one reads Vatsayan's Kama Sutra, only one chapter is about what in popular 30-second interpretations we have reduced Vatsayan to, namely sexual postures. Exactly similarly, Kama is about sensual pleasures, not just sexual pleasures. Artha is the pursuit of material well-being, prosperity, wealth, all of that. Dharma, since I've placed moksha dharma in a different category, dharma is the things that we do every day. Some of it is driven by the template of varnashram dharma, the four varnas and the four ashramas. Some of it is the individual dharma. Some of it is the nitya karma, the 5 daily yajnas that every householder has to do. Some of it is naimittik dharma, the particular rites that are observed on specific occasions. Some of it is kamya dharma, which is rites and rituals that one practices with a specific objective in mind.
How do we as a society, how are we going to be able to keep all these in balance? I think only at that point will we achieve what is popularly known as happiness. Can we achieve a kind of balance of all these? And does the Gita show us the way forward on this?
It depends entirely on you, which is a point that's made in the book. If you expect the Bhagavad Gita to tell you that get up in the morning and do 3 Surya Namaskars and you will be happy. You will be disappointed. In the Bhagavad Gita, you will find whatever you wish to find.
Right.
So the Bhagavad Gita will have different, so to speak, lessons for different people.
Right.
The word happiness is again a word that should not be bandied around.
Yes, you've talked about that.
Without care.
Yes.
What makes a person happy? What I'm happy with right now is not something that I will be happy with half an hour later. I am happy drinking a cup of coffee now. But after having drunk 20 cups of coffee, will I be happy with a 21st cup of coffee? The answer is no. So therefore, most of the time when we interpret the word happiness, we define it in terms of things that are completely temporary and transient. The message of the Bhagavad Gita is not to get attached to what is temporary and transient, but to focus on what is permanent. When we were children, there were things that made us happy. Today, those toys would not make us happy. So why should we get addicted to this notion of happiness, which normally is defined in terms of possession of objects that are purely of transient interest? The word in most Indian languages for happiness would be a word like sukha. As compared to that, there's a completely different word called shanti, which is peace, tranquility, serenity.
Yeah. Right.
And there is a shloka in the Bhagavad Gita itself which says that a person who is not serene, a person who is not tranquil, how can such a person hope to achieve proper happiness? So therefore, let us not look for 6 lessons on happiness, 3 lessons on unhappiness. What the Bhagavad Gita teaches, amongst other things, is that please do not get attached to things that are temporary. Instead, look for what is everlasting.
Mr. Debroy, the other thing that is interesting is that you have a whole lot of these new modern philosophies, mindfulness, heartfulness. In a way, they all stem from the Gita, don't they? They're just different versions or different aspects of the Gita.
Well, I cannot speak on behalf of these other philosophies. What the Bhagavad Gita talks about is perennial. And therefore, anyone who has pursued or seeks to pursue anything that is more than the immediate material, he or she will find something that resonates in the Bhagavad Gita. There are, however, 3 principles which sort of define not just the Bhagavad Gita, but Hinduism in general. The first of these is the existence of the Atman as distinct from the physical body. The second one is the continuation of the indestructible Atman when the physical body dies. Therefore, what that leads to is the concept of samsara, birth, rebirth, birth, death, rebirth. There is also the notion of therefore karma. And finally, there is this notion of union between the Jivatman, the individual Atman, and the Paramatman or the Brahman. Now, these defining principles define not just the Bhagavad Gita, all Hinduism texts. So if any kind of new teaching believes in some fashion in these, as I said, there will be resonance with the Bhagavad Gita.
Mr. Debroy, I also wanted to ask you, we've recently seen this new document, the National Education Policy, and it talks about going back to ancient texts, which I think is one huge area, glaring area that we have missed out on all these years. Would you recommend this as compulsory reading, and at what stage of a child's life?
Recommend what?
The Gita
The,
as compulsory reading in schools.
I'm against any form of compulsion.
Hmm.
And I would not recommend the reading of the Bhagavad Gita until you are ready for it.
Right.
Uh, now, whether you are ready for it or not is entirely contingent on what kind of an individual you are.
Right.
If I am going to teach Sanskrit, I think the Bhagavad Gita is a very good vehicle for teaching Sanskrit, as is the case with several Sanskrit mantras, because they are wonderful ways to teach. Particularly, remember, I said that the poetry of the Bhagavad Gita is beautiful, beautiful poetry.
Right.
But until people are ready, I don't think there is any point in forcing the Bhagavad Gita down their throats. If one were to force a Gita down anyone's throats, I would say the Ashtavakra Gita is much more direct. But like I said, I'm against compulsion.
Can we talk about the idea of Bhakti and Ahamkar? Again, very important ideas.
Ahankara is one of the most difficult things to eliminate. Ahankara is loosely translated, well, correctly actually, is loosely translated as ego. Ahankara means I am doing. It is one of the most difficult things to get rid of, especially in a day and age when all the time people are saying, watch my interview, read my article, see my picture. The word I is there everywhere. So ahankara as an ego is one of the most difficult things to get rid of, particularly because we are much more familiar with the English language. The millennials, a younger generation, or some section of the younger generation, is much more familiar with the English language, where the word I is in capital letters.
Sorry, do you remember TOI making, Times of India making I small? That was the whole
No,
idea behind it, I think.
no, I don't remember that. So, no Sanskrit or no Indian language has I or aham or whatever is the counterpart is in capitals. I think all Indians are intrinsically attuned to the idea of ahankara being less. So most Indians will not say, I am Kaveri Bamzai. They will not naturally say, I am Kaveri Bamzai. They will naturally say something like, I am known as Kaveri Bamzai. Or
Something.
my name is Kaveri Bamzai. So the
Yeah.
I is not at the forefront. So I think Ahankar is much more in the West. And Ahankar, therefore, is even more of an issue to the younger generation who have learned several different things from the West. Saying hello. The word hello has no sense of, or hi has no sense of humility. But whenever I say namaste,
Namaste.
or whenever I say namaskara, namaste is even better. I'm effectively saying I'm bowing down to you. I'm bowing down before you. Namaste. So the humility and the lack of ahankara intrinsically is part of our legacy, is intrinsically part of our tradition, It's just that we tend to forget it. You mentioned bhakti also. Bhakti is one of the most difficult things to achieve. Bhakti is not simply going to a temple and doing arti and reciting a few mantras, because proper bhakti is achieved only when you completely destroy your own ahankar. And because destroying one's own ahankar is so very difficult, the true path of bhakti is so very difficult to achieve.
Absolutely. Do you feel that the COVID times have only heightened the lessons? I know you don't like that word lessons, or only heightened the importance of a text like Bhagavad Gita.
I
These
don't
are
think,
things that we have
I don't
come
think
back
so.
to.
I
No?
don't think so. I think the Bhagavad Gita has always been there. It is just that because of COVID, people have much more of free time. They are not going to a multiplex. So what do I do with my free time? Oh, okay, maybe I shall dip into the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita has always been there.
It's there.
If you are interested in it, you'll find the time, COVID or no COVID.
Hmm. Mr. Debra, I wanted to ask you, do you often get questions about the Gita, about the Mahabharata, wherever you go? I know that you're primarily, your day job is an economist, but hasn't this avatar of yours sort of taken over that? And are you often just sort of stopped randomly and asked, okay, what does this mean? Or what does that mean? Like like I'm asking you. And how do you deal with that?
No, I am asked, but my standard response is I am not a guru. I am not a teacher. I am not going to do a Mahabharata 101. I
Right,
am not going to do a Bhagavad Gita 101.
right.
If you want answers, read the text for yourselves
Hmm.
and you will find the answers.
Hmm.
Sometimes I am asked questions that are in the nature of clarifications. Those,
Right,
of course, handled differently.
right. What does the Gita mean to you personally, and has that meaning changed over time?
What does the Gita mean to me personally?
Hmm.
It's difficult to answer that because each person finds something or the other, as I said in the Bhagavad Gita.
Hmm.
Obviously, people evolve over a period of
Right.
time. Um,
Is
so
every
if you
time you read it, do you find something new and surprising, even someone like you?
no, look, Kaveri, I don't want to say this because this is also a little bit of ahankar, which I argued against.
Hmm.
So I'm saying it reluctantly. I know the Bhagavad Gita by heart.
Wow.
So therefore, for me to rediscover something in the Bhagavad Gita is unlikely, which does not mean that I do not discover
Hmm.
things in other Gitas.
Right.
I have just done a translation. It'll take a long time for it to be published of the other Gitas in the Mahabharata. So in the course of doing that, I learned quite a bit because I wasn't familiar. Well, 25 Gitas. 20 of them are technically Gitas, but I put in some others because they were relevant, although they're not Gitas. So I learned much more from translating word by word those Gitas than the Bhagavad Gita.
Hmm. Why does this whole repackaging of the Gita as, 5 management lessons or 3 lessons, why does that irritate you so much? In a way, isn't it some way of at least popularizing it, or do you think it makes it then impossible for people to actually go back to the original text and to rely just on these adaptations or lessons, easily digested as they are?
Uh, well, people get the wrong lessons
Hmm.
because most of these books, management lessons, read the Bhagavad Gita to decide how you should handle your boss.
Right.
read the Bhagavad Gita to realize how you should deal with a wife. All of these are about the individual's relationships with the external world, external individuals, external objects. The Bhagavad Gita is not about that.
It's about
The Bhagavad Gita is about you managing your own self. It is not about these external things. In the process, if you become a changed individual, obviously that will impact your relationships with the external world, with the boss, the subordinate, the spouse, the children, the parents, whatever it may be. But the Bhagavad Gita has no lessons about how you should handle the external world. It's entirely about how you should handle yourself.
yourself.
It's internal. It's self-reflection. It's self-introspection. That is why I have nothing against these books, but I am somewhat concerned they might give the wrong impression. If they trigger a sufficient amount of interest in people to read the original Bhagavad Gita, that's fine. But I suspect that most people don't take the next step.
Right. So, if I were to ask you, if you were to look at the translation of the other Gitas that you were talking about, what did you find there that was surprising to you?
There are a whole lot of Gitas, mind you. And they have different kind of focus. So, for example, the Mahabharata is divided into 18 major segments, as everyone knows. They are known as Shanti Parva. So there are Gitas, and the Shanti Parva has 3 sections. Raja Dharma Parva, which is the dharma for kings. Apad Dharma Parva, which is the dharma in terms of calamities. Moksha Dharma, which of course is understandable. I've spoken about Moksha Dharma. I had not expected so many Gitas to be from the Raja Dharma Parva. There's a familiar shloka from the Mahabharata, which let me state in Sanskrit and then I shall translate. Kashtancha Samayetang Mahadadho Sametya Vepayatang Tatpat Bhuta Samagama. Just as pieces of wood together, just as pieces of wood come together on the giant ocean, they come together, move together for a short while, and then drift apart. The relationship of individuals in this world is also like that, meaning no relationships are permanent. We travel, Kaveri and I will travel together for a bit of some part of our lives, then we'll drift apart. That's natural. This was the substance of it. Obviously, I was familiar with it. What had not registered was that it had not registered, it should have probably, is that it was from the Pingala Gita. Pingala Gita is one of the Gitas in the Mahabharata. And Pingala is a courtesan. So there is a Gita which reflects the learnings of a courtesan. And it is Pingala who says this. Now, it had before, if you are translating something word by word, you tend to notice things that you had not noticed earlier. So this is something, I just gave that as an example of something that had not occurred to me earlier.
Right. May I, in conclusion, ask you, because you say that chapter 11 for you is this most beautiful chapter, and you've quoted 3 shlokas from this chapter. Would you like to quote one and to translate that for our readers as a parting gift?
No. You will find that I've quoted shlokas from the various parts of the Mahabharata and have translated them.
Right.
But I have avoided generally chapter 11.
11.
Generally, there are 1 or 2 rare instances, but that is to illustrate how easy it is to break up the Sanskrit. But chapter 11, I have avoided translating. The reason for that is, yes, chapter 11, the chapter about Vishwarup Darshan, Vishwarup, is a beautiful, beautiful chapter. It has to be read in the Sanskrit.
Okay.
In any other language, it ruins the beauty of that chapter. The poetry, the imagery is completely ruined.
And you talked about Robert Oppenheimer also quoting from it.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's quite remarkable how the Gita is everywhere around us. It's just, I think we've not been made conscious of it so far, and perhaps this book will, I think, go a long way in doing that, not just for millennials, as I said, but for everyone. Bibek Debroy, thank you very much again for talking to us about the
Sure.
Bhagavad Gita for millennials. Which book of yours is this?
I have no idea. I think it must be about 110 or something like that.
110th book.
Something like that. I might be 109.
Amazing. Thank you very much for doing this for us and for, I think, for all of us, not just the millennials. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste.